What is up, guys? This is Roundhouse Ape here with another video, and today I'm here with just another UFC, or not UFC, but MMA video, I guess. And it's just gonna be me highlighting some of the best fighters I think that aren't in the UFC. So I guess it's an MMA video, and it's no particular order. I think I have 11 fighters highlighted here. 10 actually are in the UFC, as you can see here when I get into the start here. So I'm just going to be kind of going down this list. It's not in any particular order, but after Michael Page here, the first four or five, I believe, have already been to the UFC and are already outside of the UFC, are back outside of the UFC. But here, starting off, it's Michael Venom Page, who's 21 and 2, and he's actually signed to the UFC. And he's his next upcoming fight is on UFC 299, so he has a fight upcoming against Kevin Holland. So his UFC debut fight will be against a fairly tough opponent in Kevin Holland who I don't know if he's ranked right now. He might have been ranked outside of the top 10 before. He's probably good enough to get into the top 10 if he fights a little bit smarter in certain fights. But if Page beats Holland, he'll be able to probably call for a top 10 matchup pretty quickly. And he has a great record. He's only been finished one time in his career, and that was against another like a pretty solid guy, Douglas Lima, who is uh who is 33 and 11, and also I no, he didn't used to, but he's been fighting for a very long time. I thought he used to fight in the UFC for some reason, but he's been in the Bellator for a while. Who also I could have put on here, but I didn't. But he lost. But so you have Page there. So he's kind of a beast. He's a finisher. 13 of his fights are by finish. He has a little bit of like a kickboxing karate kind of style. He has a wider kind of base. But if you watch some of his highlights, he's electric, man. If he can finish Kevin Holland, he'll probably be able to call for a probably decent ranked matchup, and they'll fast track him to the title if he can win the right matchups. It's just if he can win them or not. He'll be fighting at welterweight, so it'll be interesting to see. He's 36, so he still might have some time left, but he's on the wrong side of 35, obviously. So we'll see how that goes. But he's someone that the UFC already have. The next people, the next couple are people that have been in the UFC already, but are currently not in the UFC. So the first one I have here is Clay Collard, who's currently in the PFL, and he's fighting AJ McKee next, who's 21 and 1, and that will be a very interesting fight to see because AJ McKee's 21 and 1, so that's the one I need to look into more, obviously. And I only have him on this list 'cause I've watched him fight before, and I think he's very solid. He's lost to Oliver St. Mercer, is the only loss out of his last four, who's won the last two PFL championships, and then he's beaten Jeremy Stevens. But he's lost two decisions out of that too. But if you look at this, he's beaten Anthony Pettis, and then he dropped a rear naked choke back in the day. But he also used to fight in the UFC. He it looks like he went. If you look at it, he fought one, two, three, four fights in the UFC. He went 1-4, and then probably was cut after that or something. But he fought Max Holloway and lost TKO, and that might have been at featherweight when it happened. But he's just a fun fighter to watch. I'm curious to see how he does in the PFL, and he's only 30, so it wouldn't be surprising to see him back in the UFC one day. And then the next one, he's on the list. I'm gonna recognize him, but he's not. He's retired. He announced his retirement already, so he's not gonna be fighting anymore unless he comes out of retirement. But I believe he won the PFL two times. He's 21 and 5. He used to fight in the UFC also. Oliver Urban Mercer from Canada, the Canadian gangster. I don't know how to pronounce his name completely correct, but if you look here, he fought a good bit in the UFC, and all five of his losses came on the UFC. Came when he was in the UFC. So he was 1, 2, 3 and 1, 3 and 2, 4 and 2, 5 and 2, 6 and 2, 7 and 2, 7 and 3, 7 and 4. He was 7 and 5 in the UFC. So he was above 500 in the UFC with a win over Drew Dober. So he's been fighting for a pretty long time, 21 and 5, no losses outside of the UFC. So pretty successful career, even though he won't be coming back. It'd be interesting to see him come out of retirement. and beat a couple more people, but that's that. Then you have Demetrius Johnson in one championship, the first one championship fighter I'm showing here. He's 25 and 4 overall, and he's 37, so he's getting older, and he's already said that he only has a couple more fights left. So I don't ever expect him to be back in the UFC. It says bantamweight, but in one championship, their flyweight is 135. So I honestly think he is possibly he'd be the best. He is the best pound for pound flyweight in the world, I think. But I honestly think he might be the best bantamweight. I think he could be most 125ers and 135ers on the planet and in the UFC. His only losses are to Adriano Moraes, who he got back in a revenge matchup and beat him in the trilogy. So he's 2-1 against him. He lost the split decision to Henry Cejudo. He has a draw, and then he lost to Dominic Cruz, and then he has a decision back in his fourth fight. So he's very seasoned. He had that championship run in the UFC. And if you watch his Adriano Moraes fights, they were awesome fights. These were beast fights. And I honestly think him versus O'Malley, he'd probably be able to beat O'Malley. I don't him versus Moraes would be an interesting matchup, but I think he would clean through any one in the flyweight division of the UFC at 125. Him versus Pantoja and him versus Moreno would be interesting matchups, but I still think he'd be the best 125er in any promotion, and he'd he'd easily be able, not easily, but he'd definitely contend in the top five, if not beat John O'Malley probably for the bantamweight championship. I just don't know of how he'd uh, contend with all those top five guys, but we'll go on to the next one. Here we have Sergio Pettis, who's 23 and 6, who's also another guy that we've had in the UFC. He's fought some, I don't know if he's fought any notable guys, but he's only lost one, two, three, four, 5 times in the UFC. He fought Rob Font and Henry Cejudo, who he's lost to, but neither of them finished him. Um, so that's pretty good for him. And then his most recent launch since 2019 is the Patrick Mix, who's a who's a beast. He's only 30, so I mean he still can be better. I honestly think he could compete in the top 10. I don't know if he could really compete for a title right now with how stacked the bantamweight division is in the UFC, especially with that top 5 kind of top 10. But I think he could find his way into the top I think he definitely could find his way into the top 15 possibly. But the bantamweights all around the world, there's a lot of stacked ones. So I want to kind of go over pound for pound, like the UFC pound for pound list maybe eventually, or like make my own pound for pound list or like ranking kind of system or like weight. I don't know, kind of figure out or just go over rankings and then make my own kind of list for each weight class and see how that goes. But Sergio Pettis is someone that's pretty solid. That's been in the UFC before. That would be interesting to see back in the UFC because he's only 30. Then this here you have Chris Cyborg, who's 38, someone who I never expect to see back in the UFC. Her last loss is in 2018 to Amanda Nunes, and then her other loss before that was her very first fight to a knee bar. So she's basically her only loss in any kind of recent time is to like the undoubted one MMA women's GOAT. So she's still a beast at 38. It'd be cool to see her back in the UFC, but she's probably just gonna get like one or two more finishes, I'd assume, and then call it a career. I don't see her back in the UFC, but I think she's in PFL now because Bellator is kind of a part of PFL and all that. But that's kind of that with Chris Cyborg. So that's all the people that have been in the UFC before, and I'd be they're not in the UFC now. Who I think are some of the top guys outside of the UFC. Demetrius Johnson, obviously being the best out of all those people, and Michael Bennett Page being someone that's signed to the UFC currently but hasn't fought yet. Now I'm gonna show my next five here that are not have not been in the UFC, who I think are some of the best fighters not in the UFC right now. So here you have Adriano Moraes, who I was just talking about when he fought Demetrius Johnson. But if you look at it, two of his 5 losses are to Demetrius Johnson, and then before that, his last loss was in 2018 and then 2015, and they were both split decisions. And when you watch this guy fight, he's a beast. He's pretty good size for 135, and he would be an interesting matchup for anyone in the top 10 of bantamweight in the UFC. I think he'd be able to squeeze his way into the top 10. I think he'd struggle to compete for a championship and like be a mainstay in the top five with all those guys they have, obviously. But someone like him would be a great matchup for O'Malley because he has decent striking. But I think O'Malley would beat him on the feet and possibly finish him. But he has very interesting grappling because he can sit there with Demetrius Johnson, even though Demetrius Johnson is a little bit smaller. But this is a guy that I could definitely see being a top 15 in the UFC at least, and potentially finding his way to a title shot if the fights lined up right for him. And then here you have one of the best fighters that I'm going to show you, possibly the number one fighter that's not in the UFC, is Johnny Eblen. He was the bantamweight middleweight champion, and he's fighting Impa Kanesawa uh, on the PFL's Champions versus Champions card or whatever. But if I'm not mistaken, yeah, no, it is at middleweight. For some reason, I thought it was gonna be at light heavyweight, but he's fighting this guy at middleweight. He lost to I forgot who it was. He lost to Joaquin Buckley with a crazy KO knockout. But Johnny Eblen has never lost in the UFC. His biggest win is over Gegard Mousasi with a unanimous decision. But he's just He's beaten everybody he's fought so far, and he's probably the best guy in the UFC. People say he could be the middleweight champ in the UFC right now. You don't know. He's 32, so he's just going to be in his prime. So he could potentially be going on a tear here, and if he finds his way in the UFC, it could be very interesting because this is a guy that people say could win a UFC championship, like right now at middleweight, and you just never know because there's a lot of strikers there, and with how middleweight's changing belts a ton, I could literally see this guy being in the top five immediately coming in like a Michael Chandler kind of thing, like where he fought for a title pretty fast and then a couple other people, but I could see him being a top five guy for a minute, just right in there with the middleweights. But yeah. And here you have Patricio Pitbull, who's 35 and 7. I believe he fights at 145 and 155. He lost his last two, but I believe at one point he was a double champ in Bellator. He's beaten names like Michael Chandler. Um, he's had some great fights. He's a super exciting fighter. He's lost to Benson Henderson, but the thing about him is he would just be a super exciting fighter for the roster. I think if he was just the 145er, he'd possibly be a bit better, but he's a bit older, so that's someone I wouldn't expect to see fighting in the UFC much time anytime soon, if ever. But he's a beast, someone that you would want to look out for if he ever made his way to the UFC. Then our second to last fighter here is Patchy Mix. He's 19 and 1, and I believe he's the if I'm not mistaken, yeah. So if I'm not mistaken here, Sergio Pettis was the bantamweight champion last, and then Patchy Mix beat him. So I believe Patchy Mix is the current bantamweight champion of Bellator, who's 19 and 1. His last loss is in 2020 to Juan Archuleta, and before that he hadn't lost, and he had a very decent undefeated record in amateur before that. But he's a beast who obviously looks like a killer. He's beaten someone like Rafian Stott. So I seen a story about him with Marab. So I'm gonna look at him right now. Just come. So he's just been in Bellator since then. His only See, this guy was another random guy that I literally have just randomly came upon. He's 35 now, and you could see him in the UFC one day. Don't be surprised. But his only losses are to Marab Dvalishvili and Patchy Mix, and that's it. He's 35, but keep a lookout for him too. So I guess that's 12 fighters to highlight. But Patchy Mix should be a beast there. And then you have our second undefeated fighter, who's 25, Usman Nurmagomedov, who his last fight was turned into a no contest, but he's 17 and 0. His last one is Benson Henderson, and he's just a beast. He's looked kind of unstoppable right now, and this is one of those guys that people talk about when he gets to the UFC. He could be a possible champion at lightweight, but the lightweight division is stacked, so you never know. But he's one of those Dagestani guys, so you also never know. But those are my 11 or 12 guys that I think. 11 if you don't count Page, but 12 if you count Stotts and Page. But that's kind of all the people that like some of the people I think are some of the better MMA fighters outside of the UFC. If there's other fighters you like that are outside of the UFC that you think that should be mentioned or you think I should take a look at, let me know. But thank you guys for watching the video. Uh, Go like and subscribe. Kind of like I said, comment any other fighters you think I should check out that you like, and have a great day.